The decision did not arrive with a public announcement, a ceremonial statement, or even a warning. It came inside a sealed palace file, placed before Prince Edward, shortly after sunrise. One signature had removed Camilla from every private guardianship responsibility connected to Lady Louise. Edward read the order twice, closed the folder, and immediately understood what it meant. Someone had tried to place his daughter inside a royal power struggle. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward pressed his thumb against the clause carrying Louise's name and felt the room tighten around him. Buckingham Palace had formally cancelled Camilla's authority to advise on the young woman's ceremonial duties, protected inheritance arrangements, and access to selected royal residences. A guardianship role, in this case, meant private authority to guide decisions affecting another family member's future. This was not a change in etiquette. It reached into Louise's independence, her security, and the boundaries Edward believed had already been settled. The equerry waited near the desk until the Duke asked him to leave. An equerry is a royal aide trusted with personal schedules and sensitive instructions, but Edward wanted no witness to the fear rising beneath his anger. He read the directive again, then stared at the empty chair across from him. Camilla's humiliation was not his first concern. The palace's reputation was not his first concern. He needed to know whether Louise had learned that powerful people were discussing her life without her permission. Louise entered expecting an ordinary family conversation, and stopped when she saw the open folder. Her father did not soften the truth. Edward told her that the Queen Consort no longer held authority over her private arrangements, then placed his palm over the pages, as if physically blocking them from reaching her. "No one will decide your place in this family without you again," he said. Louise held his gaze, but the silence that followed revealed both relief and a deeper wound. She had suspected something was happening. The final page changed everything. Charles had approved an emergency protective provision, a special safeguard used when an advisor's personal interests might conflict with another family member's welfare. That language transformed the removal from routine restructuring into a deeply personal warning. Edward demanded the evidence behind it. The official returned with a second sealed document and explained that it contained a documented account linked to Louise's late grandmother. Edward had protected his daughter from the order's immediate consequences, but to understand why Camilla had been removed, he first had to confront the complicated loyalties surrounding Louise herself. Lady Louise had spent years avoiding the kind of attention that consumed other members of the royal family. She built a life around privacy, university, family, and the quiet strength inherited from her parents. Yet on this morning, her name sat at the center of a palace order powerful enough to strip Camilla of authority. Louise had never demanded influence, but influence had now reached into her life and forced her to choose whom she trusted. Louise remained opposite her father, trying to understand how a life she had kept quiet had become the subject of sealed orders and private arguments. She had grown up close to the monarchy without treating that closeness as a prize. Edward and Sophie had encouraged study, independence, and responsibility because they wanted their daughter to know herself before the institution tried to define her. That boundary mattered now. Someone had crossed it. Louise lowered her voice and asked whether silence might stop the crisis from spreading. She feared Camilla's removal would humiliate Charles, deepen old wounds, and turn her into the reason another royal conflict reached the public. Edward heard guilt where there should have been none. He left the opposite chair, sat beside her, and told his daughter that protecting herself was not disloyalty. The Duke made one thing clear: she would not be used to protect another person's dignity at the cost of her own peace. Camilla's cancelled role had carried more power than Louise first understood. It would have allowed the Queen Consort to influence which patronages she accepted, where she stood during future state occasions, and how selected family possessions were managed for her. A patronage is a public connection between a royal and an organization, while a state occasion is an official national ceremony where position can signal status. These were not harmless details. They could shape Louise's future identity inside the family. Louise admitted that she had resisted before. Weeks earlier, she had quietly declined a ceremonial position recommended through Camilla's household. She had offered no public reason, but the refusal triggered a tense private exchange that Edward had never been told about. His expression hardened, not because she had said no, but because someone had made her believe the disagreement had to remain secret. Sophie entered carrying a handwritten note. The trusted confidant placed it before Edward and explained that Louise had written it immediately after the disputed proposal, while every word was still fresh. He looked from his wife to his daughter as the silence changed shape. That single conversation would become the point of no return, exposing how a seemingly polite royal proposal had transformed into a battle over Louise's independence. The crisis could be traced to one precise evening. After a private memorial service at Windsor, Camilla asked Lady Louise to remain behind while the rest of the family moved toward dinner. The exchange lasted less than 15 minutes, but Louise left the room pale and unusually silent. What had been presented as gentle royal guidance had carried a hidden condition, and that condition eventually forced the palace to act. Camilla began with praise. She told Louise that the family needed younger voices and offered her a newly created ceremonial position, tied to several charities and future state appearances. A ceremonial position is a public royal duty built around formal events, causes, and representation. The offer sounded generous, even protective, but the condition beneath it was serious. Louise would have to place her schedule and selected property decisions under the Queen's household. Louise felt the danger before she understood it. Accepting would reduce Edward and Sophie's involvement while placing her future in the hands of advisors she had never chosen. She asked for time. Camilla smiled, but the warmth disappeared from her words as she warned that refusal could be seen as rejecting Charles's vision of a more unified monarchy. The king's plan had turned a personal choice into a test of loyalty. The pressure became impossible to ignore. Camilla reached across the table and slid a prepared acceptance page toward Louise. The document was already arranged for signature, leaving no space for questions and little room for refusal. Louise stared at the pen but did not touch it. She stood, thanked the Queen, and walked away with trembling hands, knowing politeness had just saved her from surrendering control. Sophie noticed the change that night. The trusted confidant found her daughter withdrawn and asked what had happened. Louise wrote the conversation from memory, including the exact phrases, the pressure involving Charles, and the condition linking the role to Camilla's guardianship authority. Sophie preserved the handwritten account because she understood that memory could be challenged, but ink could not be dismissed so easily. A senior household secretary later strengthened the record through a documented account submitted to the Palace Review. The official confirmed that Louise entered the room alone, emerged visibly shaken, and left behind an unsigned acceptance page. Edward read both accounts and found the final betrayal. Camilla had asked Louise not to involve her parents until the arrangement was approved. He closed his eyes, set the note down, and requested an immediate face-to-face meeting. The dispute was no longer about palace procedure. It had become a confrontation between a father who felt his family had been bypassed and a queen determined to defend her intentions. There were no advisors in the room when Edward confronted Camilla. No private secretary could soften his words, and no courtier could redirect the conversation toward protocol. He entered carrying Louise's handwritten account and placed it on the table between them. Camilla looked down at the page but did not touch it. Then Edward asked the question that shattered the remaining politeness. Why was my daughter told to keep this from her parents? Edward had chosen a small Windsor sitting room because he wanted nowhere for the truth to hide. A private secretary is a senior aide who manages royal duties and sensitive communication, while a courtier serves within the royal household. Neither was allowed inside. The Duke wanted Camilla's answer, not a careful statement shaped by people trained to protect reputations. Camilla drew a slow breath and defended the proposal as an act of protection. She argued that Louise needed a meaningful future role before the monarchy became even more centered around William and his children. Without guidance, the Queen warned, the young woman could be overlooked and left without purpose. Edward heard the reasoning, but he also heard the threat beneath it. Edward pointed toward Louise's handwritten account. Protection, he said, did not begin with secrecy. Using Charles's name to pressure his daughter had transformed an invitation into an ultimatum. Camilla stiffened and insisted she had never intended to frighten Louise. Her composure faltered when the Duke replied that intentions stopped mattering the moment trust was broken. The room fell silent. Edward removed Camilla's copy of the proposed guardianship arrangement, a document giving one person formal influence over another's private decisions. He did not tear the pages or damage the seal. He simply turned the agreement face down. The gesture carried more force than shouting, because it told the Queen that, in his mind, her authority was already finished. Camilla finally admitted what he had suspected. She said involving him earlier would probably have led to an immediate refusal. The confession confirmed that she had approached Louise first, because the daughter seemed easier to persuade than the father. Edward's anger sharpened, but his voice became quieter. Camilla warned that Charles had approved the broader plan, even if the king had not known every detail. Edward gathered Louise's account and answered that his brother must now choose whether protecting the institution mattered more than protecting her. The confrontation ended with Camilla standing alone beside the face-down agreement, while Edward carried the dispute toward the one person whose authority could make the removal permanent. Charles did not defend Camilla immediately. He sat at his desk with Louise's account in one hand and the Palace Review in the other, reading the same lines until the room became painfully still. Edward stood across from him, waiting not as a younger brother seeking favor, but as a father demanding protection. The king's silence lasted so long that even Edward began to fear the monarchy would choose convenience over truth. Charles understood that his signature alone could not finish the matter. The private royal household, meaning the staff and offices serving the sovereign's family, remained under his authority, while independent trustees controlled the protected arrangements connected to Louise. Both sides had to agree before Camilla's removal became complete. That balance mattered, because one decision governed palace access, while the other protected inheritance, property, and long-term security. Edward watched his brother examine the evidence. Louise's handwritten account lay beside the secretary's documented statement, the unsigned acceptance page, and correspondence, proving that he and Sophie had been excluded from the early discussions. The Duke had supported the crown for years, without demanding attention, influence, or reward. Now he asked for one thing: that his daughter never be treated as an available piece in someone else's strategy. Charles felt the conflict cut in two directions. Defending Camilla might protect his marriage from humiliation, but it could destroy Edward's trust and leave Louise exposed to pressure she had already rejected. The monarch was not choosing between strangers. He was choosing between loyalty to his wife and responsibility toward a young woman who had asked to control her own life. The pen moved closer. Charles placed the Palace Review beside the removal order, lifted his hand, then stopped. He asked whether Louise truly wanted the Queen Consort excluded, or whether another decision was being made around her without consent. Edward answered by producing a recorded conversation, created at his daughter's request. Louise's voice remained calm throughout the recording. She said she wanted authority over her future and no longer felt comfortable with Camilla controlling any part of her private arrangements. Charles listened without interruption. When the message ended, he signed the confirmation and ordered her wishes entered into the permanent family record. By the time the ink dried, doors were already closing, instructions were being withdrawn, and Camilla was discovering how quickly royal influence could disappear. The first consequence was almost invisible. At an afternoon household meeting, a chair normally reserved for Camilla's representative had been removed from the table. No announcement accompanied the change, no one explained it. Camilla entered, saw the empty space, and understood immediately that the order had already taken effect. Her name remained on the palace walls, but within Louise's future, her influence had vanished. Camilla dismissed her aide and remained alone after the others left. The household meeting controlled access to schedules, official correspondence, and private family decisions, so the missing chair was more than an insult. It confirmed that her office could no longer view Louise's diary, recommend future ceremonial roles, or attend discussions involving the family trust. A family trust is a protected arrangement used to manage property, inheritance, and long-term financial interests. The queen removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes. She asked whether Charles had personally approved what felt like a public humiliation, carried out without a public word. Elsewhere, pending recommendations from her household were frozen and returned to Edward and Sophie. The Duke became the principal family representative for his daughter's protected arrangements, but Louise herself gained the final power to approve or reject every major proposal. Charles met Camilla privately before evening. The king told her the decision had not been designed as punishment, it had been made to restore Louise's trust. She answered that the difference offered little comfort when every aide in the household could see that she had been overruled. He did not reverse the order. His silence confirmed that the signature would stand. The consequences widened. Trustees disclosed through a documented review that Louise's arrangement was not the only responsibility linked to Camilla's advisory position. Several informal powers were now under examination to determine whether other family members had consented freely. The Queen understood that losing one role might become the beginning of a much larger retreat. Louise refused to turn that retreat into revenge. When an official told her that a formal statement could place direct blame on Camilla, she rejected it. Her recorded response insisted that any announcement should focus on personal independence, not use private distress as a weapon against another woman. Edward heard those words and saw his daughter differently. Louise was not merely someone waiting to be protected. Her restraint carried its own strength, and it forced him to question whether love could become another kind of control. The removal had altered the palace structure, but the true turning point would come away from officials and documents. When Edward finally allowed Louise to speak, without trying to protect her from every consequence. Edward found Louise outside after dusk, away from secretaries, advisors, and the machinery of the palace. For the first time since the order arrived, he did not carry a folder or prepare a speech. He simply stood beside his daughter and admitted that his instinct to protect her could become another form of control. Louise looked at him with surprise, because the father who had fought for her was now asking whether he had truly listened. Edward let the silence settle between them. They were alone, on a quiet Windsor walkway, with no official present to shape the conversation or record a careful version of it. That absence mattered. Palace procedure had turned Louise into a name inside documents, but here she could speak as a daughter, whose future had nearly been arranged without her consent. The Duke admitted what had frightened him most. Camilla's secrecy had made him fear that Louise's kindness, privacy, and distance from royal politics were being mistaken for weakness. He had reacted by placing himself between her and every possible threat. Yet in doing so, he now understood that protection could become another barrier if it left no room for her own voice. Louise thanked her father for defending her, then challenged him with quiet honesty. She did not want to escape Camilla's control only to enter his. Her future, she said, had to belong to her, even when her choices disappointed the family or disturbed the palace. Edward lowered his head and apologized for speaking on her behalf before asking what she actually wanted. Louise answered without hesitation. She would accept selected public duties under an independent arrangement, a system allowing her parents to remain informed while giving her final approval over every appearance, patronage, and commitment. A patronage is a formal connection between a royal and an organization, but Louise wanted those connections chosen through conviction rather than pressure. Compassion shaped her next decision. She would not seek immediate reconciliation with Camilla, yet she asked Edward not to isolate the Queen permanently. Accountability, Louise explained, should create strong boundaries, not another lifelong exile inside a family already wounded by separation. Her father heard strength where others had expected softness. Edward asked whether she was ready to make that position public. Louise said she would stand beside him, but the words had to be hers. He agreed, finally understanding that stepping back did not mean abandoning her. The palace had expected Edward to become the face of the dispute, but the next morning, it was Louise's own voice that transformed a private family crisis into a public reckoning. By morning, the decision could no longer be contained behind palace doors. Broadcasters interrupted their schedules as Buckingham Palace released a statement confirming that Lady Louise would now control her own ceremonial and private arrangements. Yet it was not the official wording that captured the country. It was the sight of Louise stepping through the gates beside Edward, pausing before the cameras, and speaking with a calmness that made the entire crisis suddenly human. Louise read the palace statement before leaving Windsor and noticed what had been left out. Camilla had been removed from the guardianship and advisory role connected to her future, but the wording avoided blame and focused on consent, independence, and restored authority. A guardianship role meant formal influence over personal decisions, while an advisory role allowed recommendations about duties and appearances. Both powers now belonged to Louise herself. Charles approved the restructuring and ordered senior courtiers not to brief against Camilla or suggest that Louise had caused the crisis. Sophie remained close to her daughter in private, helping her prepare without choosing the words for her. The king wanted discipline. The trusted confidant wanted calm. Louise wanted the truth to sound like her own voice. Edward approached the gates beside his daughter and instinctively moved half a step ahead. Years of protection had trained him to meet danger first. Louise touched his arm gently. He understood, slowed, and stepped back. That movement carried everything they had said the night before. He would stand near her, but he would no longer stand in her place. Louise faced the waiting press and spoke without anger. "My father protected my right to choose. Now he is protecting my right to speak for myself." Edward swallowed, looked away briefly, then returned his gaze to her with unmistakable pride. The Duke had defended a daughter. In that moment, he witnessed a woman defend herself. The next edition of a major London newspaper printed their photograph beneath the headline, "A father defends, a daughter decides." Commentators had first framed the event as another royal conflict involving Camilla, but Louise's measured words changed the debate. Public attention shifted toward consent, family boundaries, and whether younger royals had the right to reject duties imposed through private pressure. Louise refused to let applause become the ending. Through a recorded message delivered to Camilla's office, she requested one brief private meeting. She would not restore the cancelled authority. She wanted the conflict ended with boundaries neither woman could later misunderstand. The world had delivered its judgment through headlines and applause, but the final verdict belonged inside a private room where Louise and Camilla would face each other without titles standing between them. Louise did not enter the final meeting seeking an apology dramatic enough for the newspapers. She wanted something quieter and more difficult, a clear boundary that could survive after public attention faded. Camilla waited beside the same table where the disputed proposal had once been discussed. This time, there was no prepared page, no pen, and no expectation of obedience. There were only two women confronting the damage created when guidance became pressure. Louise asked Edward to wait outside, and made him promise not to enter unless she called. He agreed, understanding that protection now meant trusting her judgment, rather than speaking over it. Inside, she explained that the new arrangement gave her final authority over public duties, property decisions, correspondence, and ceremonial commitments. Edward and Sophie could advise her, but no royal household could act without her written consent. Camilla listened without interruption. The Queen admitted that she had treated Louise's hesitation as an obstacle to overcome instead of a boundary to respect. She did not excuse the secrecy, and she accepted that the guardianship role, a formal position granting influence over another person's private decisions, would never be restored. For the first time, her regret sounded less like wounded pride and more like recognition. Louise answered with firmness, not cruelty. She said the pressure had frightened her and made her feel manipulated, but she did not want Camilla erased from the family. A personal relationship might survive one day. Authority would not return. That distinction mattered because forgiveness without boundaries would only invite the same harm again. Camilla reached for the original acceptance page and handed it across the table. Louise tore it once through the center and placed both pieces down. She did not smile. She did not hesitate. The proposal ended there. Edward looked up when his daughter emerged. He did not ask what the Queen had said or demand every detail. He asked only whether Louise was satisfied. She answered yes, and he accepted it. Charles had preserved the family by choosing consent over convenience. Camilla lost authority without being publicly destroyed. Louise emerged not as a sheltered royal child, but as an adult whose quiet courage forced the monarchy to respect personal boundaries. That became the true legacy of a crisis meant to silence her. The palace order began as a removal, but it ended as something far more lasting. A father learning when to stand in front of his daughter, when to stand beside her, and when to step back as she confidently stood alone. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.